Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I first want to congratulate the Publicity Club of Chicago on choosing two wonderful people to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award. Jim and Rick have been friends of mine for a long time. They've been part of my family, and I'm very glad to join in with all of you in honoring them, who have honored me in many ways. This is a very important event for me. I finally reached the pinnacle of success in life. It is illustrated by a cartoon that was in the New York Times last year. This little boy is looking up at his father and he says, "Daddy, when I grow up, I want to be a former president." Well, Jim and Rick helped me become, I wouldn't say they helped me become a president. I think I became a former president because of my own failings in the 1980 election. But we have very fine memories and foundation of life from having been in the White House. In a few months, I'll be 90 years old. In 1 month, I will have been married to the same woman for 68 years. We have 4 children, we have 12 grandchildren, and we have 9 great-grandchildren with another one on the way. So our life has been built around family, and I would say that Jim and also Rick have been part of our growing family, and I'm very grateful to it. I know that this award is special to them, not because of a recognition here in Chicago, but because Chicago has, I think, a well-deserved reputation around the world of bringing together public relations and the holding of events and the production of good trade and commerce, but also has a special ability to add heart to these kinds of accomplishments that prevail not just in Chicago or the United States, but around the world. Typically tonight, both Jim and Rick said to me, "Mr. President, don't talk about us, talk about how this group assembled here at this beautiful hotel can expand our influence for the well-being of other people who are not so fortunate as those of us in this room." And I will take their advice, but I'm a former president, and I have the prerogative of doing both. If I want to, I'll talk about them and also talk about how we can expand our influence around the world. And I can do this, I believe, in the assigned time that I have of just 10 minutes. So I'm looking forward to that as well. Well, Jim came to work for Fritz Mondale, my choice of vice president when I got the nomination assured in 1976. And he became part of the Carter Center team. Fritz Mondale was the first vice president who ever moved into the White House alongside the president himself. And Fritz Mondale was the first vice president who ever had an equal role along with the president in dealing with the most important issues of the day. I never had a meeting while I was president from which my Vice President Mondale was excluded. And he made innumerable trips around the nation representing our entire administration. And Jim Terman became one of those who was a lead for Fritz Mondale wherever he went. Fritz also went overseas in some very important events, and Jim was there with him and planned the trips as well. Fritz was the first international leader who ever looked at South Africa and said, "We have to have in South Africa one man, one vote." And Fritz said this to the then apartheid president of South Africa. That's the kind of vice president he was, and Jim played an integral role in that process. There's another story about Rick Jasculca. I had a good friend named Lou Lerner, who was an early supporter of mine in 1976, and he had some influence, I understand, with Rick Jasculca. And he called Rick in and said, Rick, I want you to serve maybe and give some help to the next president of the United States. And Rick said, who is that? And Lou Dorner said, Jimmy Carter. And I understand Rick said, who the hell is Jimmy Carter? Well, that was the first contact we had. I'm glad I didn't know about it at the time. But Rick then began to be a campaign helper for us when we ran for public office in 1976. And when we got to the White House, Rick moved in with us. At first, he also helped Vice President Mondale. And then he went and helped my wife. And he was the leader for all the things that Rosen did at that time, primarily involved in mental health, in which he's still involved. And Rick continued even after I no longer was President of the United States. When we had the ceremony to inaugurate the Carter Center, Rick Jasculca was there with his entire family. And then later, when we began to expand our influence in the work of the Carter Center, we helped to fulfill some of Rick's ambitions that he mentioned to me tonight of just getting this group and others to help people in need. So as we have moved around the world with projects in 80 countries on earth, 35 of them in Africa, Rick and his children have been there with us. And they have been there when I got off a plane to help me in Ethiopia, in Egypt, in Syria, in Nepal, in Burkina Faso, in Darfur, in Sudan, in southern Sudan, and in about 20 other countries in which the Carter Center has had our efforts made and sometimes completed. Rick and them have also helped us in plans for going to our Habitat for Humanity projects. Rosa and I will be going to our 31st annual one-week work at Habitat this year, and next year we'll be going to the western part of Nepal to build 100 houses there in 5 days. This is something we do every year. But our main work has been in the Carter Center, and in closing my remarks, I'll just give you a few things on which Rick and his family have helped us very much. We primarily concentrate on neglected tropical diseases. These are diseases that are known by the World Health Organization as special because they are neglected, which means that the diseases are unpleasant for anyone else to deal with. And one of the principles of the Carter Center is that we don't duplicate what others do. If the World Bank or the United Nations or the World Health Organization or the U.S. government or Harvard University is doing something adequately, we don't get involved in it. We just fill vacuums in the world. And one of the main vacuums that we saw at first was a disease called guinea worm. And I'm not going to describe it because you've just got through eating, and it's not a pleasant thing to talk about. But people that are in the most poor parts of the world, where they don't have any running water and no wells, they survive by drinking water out of rain ponds that fill up during the 3 months of rainy season, and then the water gets more and more stagnant the other 9 months. And the guinea worm eggs grow there. And if you drink the water, then 12 months later you have a worm about this long that penetrates the skin and comes out of your body, and it takes about 30 days to emerge, causing very terrible anguish and pain. And if you have studied the Old Testament of the Bible, the Hebrew text, you know that this is a fiery serpent that afflicted the Jews who were escaping from Egypt from slavery into freedom. And if you've seen the symbol for a medical doctor, which is a staff with something wrapped around it, that's not a snake, that's a guinea worm. Because that's the only way that was used to treat guinea worm problems for at least 10,000 years. As the worm emerges from the body, the medical doctors and others would wrap the worm around something about as big as a pencil and put a little tension on it. And if you didn't pull it too hard and break the worm, then it would come out maybe in 20 days instead of 30 days. That was the only solution to it until the Carter Center became involved in it with the help of Rick Jasculca and his family. We started out and we found guinea worm in 20 countries on earth, 3 in Asia and 17 in Sub-Saharan Africa, and 23,500 villages and we've now sent our people into every village. We found 3.5 million cases of guinea worm in the world. And last year we had 148 cases in the entire world. And this year, so far, we've got 19 cases in the world. So this is something that has been made possible by Rick Jasculca and his family helping us as partners, representing the Publicity Club and those of you who are assembled here tonight to say, how can we use our great advantages in life to help people in need? Another issue on which the Carter Center has been working with the help of Rick and others is trying to bring democracy and freedom to the world. We started the process of monitoring elections from outside, and we only deal with troubled elections, ones that couldn't be safe or fair or free if we weren't there. And we've now finished 97 elections in the world, helping to promote democracy and freedom to carry out some of the purposes that you all represent here tonight. The last thing I'll mention, to stay within my time limit, is human rights. And in our process of going into 80 countries in the world and dealing with the problems there, we have seen that the number one unaddressed problem on earth and the number one unresolved human rights violations on earth is the deprivation of equal rights to women and girls. I've just written a book about it that came out the last week in March called A Time for Action, Women, Religion, and Violence and Power. And it's already a bestseller, but the reason I wrote this book, which happens to be my 28th book, is to point out to the world how much we need to do to work together. You probably heard about the honor killings just recently in Pakistan, where a young woman who married a man that her father didn't approve was accused by her father of kidnapping his daughter. She was on the way to the courthouse to testify on behalf of her husband, whom she loved, and she was attacked by her father and her two brothers, and she was stoned to death. This happens about 20,000 times every year in the world, and it happens 3 times a day in Pakistan. That's honor killings, an abuse of girls, and particularly young girls. Sometimes those who are raped by foreigners or by strangers are still killed by their own family because they claim this brought dishonor to their family. You probably have heard, too, that there's a disparity in population in China and India and other big countries. They both have about 1 billion people living in them. And for every 100 boys in China, every 100 girls in China, there are 118 boys. For every 100 boys in India, for every 100 boys in India, there are for every 114 boys in India, there are just 100 girls. So there are 14% of the girls missing in India, and there are 18% of the girls missing in China. This means that there are more than 150 million girls missing from the face of the earth that should be living today. Just because they are girl babies, they are strangled by their parents at birth, either because the family is too poor to support additional children, or because the governments, like in India and China, mandate that they can only have 1 or 2 children. 1 is best, 2 is most, and they want boys to support them in their old age. So now with the advent of sonograms, the parents can detect before birth that a fetus is going to develop into a girl, and they abort the fetus. So here you have a massive murder of little babies by their parents. There's a movie that came out in November called It's a Girl. That's when it premiered. And there's a woman in there from India who testifies with some degree of pride. I have strangled 7 daughters at birth. This is the kind of thing that happens overseas. But in our country, it also is happening. In the universities of our country, I've been a professor at Emory University now for 32 years. At Emory, at Yale, Harvard, Princeton, the University of Chicago, Stanford, and other places, there is terrible incidents of sexual assault. But only one case out of 25 of sexual assault on American university campuses is ever reported to the authorities, because the leaders of those universities, the presidents and the deans and others, don't want it to be known that these crimes are taking place on their own campuses. So the girls who are assaulted are advised not to make an official case of it. And it's a very rare case, 1 in 25 that's ever reported. And we have even a worse case that's been revealed recently in the U.S. military, the other revered institution of our country. About one person out of every 100 who is accused of sexual assault in the military has ever been convicted. We have another problem, this is the last thing I'll mention, of slavery. I grew up in the South where my great-great-grandfather had slaves. And we know that in the 18th and 19th century we had a terrible case of slavery. That was abolished in our country and in England and every place else. But we have more slavery now than we ever had in the 18th and 19th century. Primarily, people sold into sexual slavery, and that's girls. The United States Congress has passed a law requiring that the State Department of our country report slavery around the world. And they issued a report, the United Nations issued a report last week in May, that the amount of sexual slavery grosses $99 billion every year. In Atlanta, Georgia, every month, between 200 and 300 girls from foreign countries are sold into sexual slavery in this country. And the State Department estimates that last year, in 2013, 60,000 girls were sold into slavery in the United States of America. These are the kinds of things that go on as some of the grossest, most despicable, unaddressed human rights problems on earth. That's the kind of thing on which the Carter Center is working with the help of people like Rick Jasculca and Jim. And we just want to point out some of these things and say that the influence, the beneficial influence of this group of Chicago is being spread out throughout the world. I'm very proud of Jim and Rick and what they've meant to me personally as members of the Carter family. But they also are just as precious to you as members of this family of Chicago, one of the greatest cities on earth. Thank you very much.
President Carter, on behalf of the Board of Directors and the members of the Publicity Club, to thank you for being here tonight. I'd like to present you with two small tokens of our appreciation that we hope will help the Carter Center continue the important work it's doing around the world. Thank you very much for making tonight somewhat memorable.